When people think about D&D, they think of rolling dice, and for good reason. The rattling of clickety-clackety math rocks is a fundamental part of the game. But rolling dice, especially for ability checks, is so much more than getting a number to see if you succeed or fail a particular activity. A single roll can have a much larger impact than just that moment. It can impact a series of sessions or an entire campaign, and when these rolls occur, the tension and anticipation can be rife for all involved. On top of this, the added bonuses a player receives to their d20 roll can validate a character's build and be a justification for the player's value to a party, especially for those prioritizing the role-playing aspect of the game over the combat system. In turn, these roles play an essential part in the enjoyment and fulfillment people receive from playing D&D. The ineffable emotion, the abstract importance behind ability checks for a lot of people is what D&D is about. So for Baldur's Gate 3, a game that is directly based on D&D's 5th edition, being able to imbue players with these feelings is essential to actually emulating the essence of playing D&D. And to me, the changes BG3 has made to its dice rolling UI with its newly released patch 5 help the game effectively represent this. When playing on patch 4, rolling ability checks felt slightly hollow and uneventful. I was still having a great time, it just felt like this pivotal process was missing some things, like it was a shell of potential. I couldn't identify what needed to be there, I just knew there was a void that needed to be filled. BG3 is an early access, so this is exactly what you'd expect. But the changes the game has introduced with patch 5 have done an amazing job at transitioning ability checks away from routine button presses that don't feel special to moments which connect you greatly to the world and its characters. While on the surface the changes seem small, their impact is rather large. The first two changes now more prominently display important information on the dice rolling interface. The first change shows the difficulty of each check, and the second change displays the bonuses your characters get to a roll. These two things highlight the math behind the process and help the player understand what they are trying to do and how their character's build is aiding or hurting this. The third change, the allowance to add guidance to any roll with ease, acts mostly as a nice feature to make the game easier and more fluid to play. Let's start talking about the first big change Larian Studios has made, which is putting the raw DC, aka dice check or difficulty class if you want to use its actual name, as the prominent number shown on the interface. This is the number you need to reach in order to succeed on a check. Before, the game would show you the number you needed to roll to succeed, with your bonuses already taken into account. For example, if you have +3 bonuses on a DC 15, it shows 15, where before it would have shown 12. The great thing about the change is that it visually lets you know how hard any single given roll is, also making it easier to understand its difficulty compared to other ability checks. This sort of visualization is what a lot of the changes are about and can also be seen when rolling with advantage, where now you actually will roll 2 dice. Rolling with advantage is a special event in D&D, and having advantage rolls just sort of done in the background was lame, and a perfect encapsulation of how the old system dampened the anticipation and enthusiasm players have when rolling ability checks. Now, on the rare occasion you do get advantage, watching both dice tumble around their imaginary box really demonstrates the importance of the moment, even more so when one of the rolls fails. And displaying not just advantage, but also the difficulty class of these rolls gives the player greater recognition of ability check status and meaning within the game. Having this recognition, in turn, allows you to fully feel the joy of succeeding on a roll, riding the high of having the random number generator fall in your favor, while equally letting you feel the frustration of failing a simple check, because what are the odds you only rolled a 3? That's some bullshit right there. With the old system, the DC might be 15, but you have +7 bonuses, so it would display an 8 as the required roll, or target as it referred to it as, while a DC of 10, where you have no bonuses, would display a target 10. Instinctively, you would assume the target 10 was a harder roll. There's nothing really inherently wrong with this, but it meant as a player, I was never really comprehending the monumentality of the task I was undertaking. It all sort of felt muddled and abstract. Even more discouraging, I was rarely proud or happy that I passed a check, because the number it was displaying was often middling or low. Why would I feel good about passing a check where I needed to roll a 6? That's not that impressive. Let me give you an example. When playing on the old system, after I had murdered a compendium of goblins in Blighted Town, I met these fine ogre folk who were partial to me becoming a tasty treat, an end I was none too fond of. Using my natural charm and guided gift of the gab, I was able to succeed on a DC 20 persuasion roll, and garnered the ability to call them into battle as new employees, a part of my quickly growing enterprise. Succeeding on this high roll should have been extremely satisfying, and I should have felt amazing when I later called them into the fray to slay their previous management. but this feeling was muted because I had +7 bonuses to the roll and the number displayed was only 13, a much less impressive mark to hit. Sure, you could do the math to deduce the true DC or hover over the number to have it revealed in a smaller, seemingly less meaningful window, and I was doing this a lot to see what the actual check was, but that would take me away from the fun of the roll and out of the moment. More specifically though, there's an instinctive psychological element to seeing this number at the forefront of the dice rolling process, and any logic or reasoning done by the player is extra mental work, one that fights against their natural inclinations. And yeah, this isn't overly cumbersome by any means, but good design should be easy and feel fluid for the player, and that's what the new interface achieves. Plus, doing the math or looking at the actual DC may have helped me understand individual checks, but it never really led me to building an internal schema for comparison where I could recognize, oh, this persuasion check is much harder than the religion check I made earlier. Something which is desirable because it helps contextualize situations, better fleshing out the world and your character's actions and impacts within it. And the game does a great job of supplying this context through its dialogue and general world building, but it's not always 100% clear. And ultimately, this is a video game, and a sizable chunk of players are going to speed through these conversations and miss all the well-crafted subtext created by the script, the voice actor's tonality, the character model's animations, and so on. So, giving the players an easy-to-interpret numeric system that they can use as a guide to contextualize the world is crucial. With the previous system, for me, and I'm sure a lot of players, ability checks difficulty in relation to each other just washed over us due to the lack of core system to build from. Having the difficulty class displayed now provides that core system. Every check is easily related back to this number, overall letting you know how difficult what you are trying to do is and how your character's build is assisting your rolls. This leads to the other big change, the fact that the bonuses to your rolls are now displayed below the dice and will add to your d20 roll after it has been rolled, instead of how it was previously, where the bonuses were pre-added to the roll, with the game telling you what DC number you needed to roll in order to succeed, as we just talked about. An amazing change which captures the spirit of D&D, as people roll then add their bonuses, rather than the other way around. More importantly though, this change forefronts the importance of your class build into ability checks. Specializing your class and carefully selecting particular stats and proficiencies is an enormous part of the character creation process, and continues to be massively impactful throughout the entire campaign. Patch 5 pulls your purposefully deliberated bonuses out from behind the dice and proudly displays the advantages your build is providing you, equipped with cool symbols and all. To cap this off, it even has a nice visceral animation of the bonuses adding to your roll, which adds to the level of satisfaction. Whereas before, you'd have to hover your mouse over the dice to see what bonuses you were receiving, and the fanfare for such additions was simply some nice green text, which was still good, but nowhere near as visually affirming. When playing on patch 4, I sort of forgot what my stats and proficiencies were because I was never really seeing them. This was also due to the fact that the menu they were in was one I never really use. Choosing your stats at the beginning of the game is a big deal, but outside of your main skill, which is used to determine damage bonuses, Constitution, which affects your total health, and maybe strength for jumping and stuff, the other stats may not be seemingly relevant at all throughout the flow of the game, and their effect when playing BG3 can be totally hidden. So why did I spend so long debating whether I wanted to spend the 2 points it cost to move a skill from 13 to 14 to get 14 wisdom and a +2 on wisdom checks, instead of spending those 2 points on intelligence, moving my intelligence from 8 to 10? I'm basically never noticing the difference or when it's relevant. The old interface at times made the choices I made feel inconsequential and to a degree meaningless. The new interface doesn't change any of the actual mechanics, but it does a lot to change your perception. Whenever you make a roll, seeing your stat modifier under the dice, the +2 wisdom or whatever, constantly reinforces the choices you made and reminds you what your stats are and why they matter. This is even more apparent with proficiencies. Picking your proficiencies can take quite some time, and this is where you can often differentiate yourself from others of the same class. Furthermore, outside of race and class, they're usually the largest indicator to determine what sort of character you are role-playing. Even if it's only superficial and internal, which most D&D characterization is, these variances can affect the way you think about yourself. Choosing between a proficiency in animal handling over medicine might mean more than the bonuses they bring. This might be the difference between you playing a character who cares for animals and has a history of owning pets, versus someone who knows how to clean wounds after a fight and is known for their ad hoc medicinal remedies. The visual of seeing proficiency bonuses sitting under the dice fully lets you know when the choices you made at the beginning of the game are having an impact, how much they are affecting your experience with the game, and reinforce who you are as a character. While this was kind of there before, it's much more apparent now and aids in immersing the player into the worlds. Playing with this new UI, I felt the game was really starting to be imbued with the feeling that ability checks come with D&D, where you make a roll, then look at your character sheet, add your ability modifier, add your proficiency bonus, and turn a subpar 8 into a respectable 14. This is all the more rewarding when you see the bonuses fly onto a D20 roll that would have resulted in a failure and watch them change it to one that succeeds. It really makes you feel like your character, your build is the reason that you are able to pass a check, and your past choices are to herald for why you can now get an extra item, get new information, or altogether avoid a fight. Shifting to the last major change that's been made, it must be recognized that it is very clear Larian wants you to have access to the guidance spell, a spell which gives you an extra 1d4 to any ability check you make. A pretty sizable buff and arguably one of the best cantrips in the game. The first companion you meet, Shadowheart, has it equipped, and just in case you decide you don't want her in your party, well, don't worry, there's a necklace you can get pretty early on which gives the wearer the spell. Now everyone 100% has the spell, there's no need to fear that the players will be a bunch of sad sacks rolling with just their base modifiers. Ugh. I'm not the biggest fan of this, as guidance is a strong spell, and having the spell somewhat dampens the effect high stats and proficiencies provide by giving an almost equivalent bonus on every roll. It would be nicer if those who only went out of their way to get the bonus by taking a class that has the spell received it, because as I said, it's really strong and it makes the stat and proficiency choices less meaningful. But Larian is a benevolent game designer and grants this gift to all players. This is even more true with the new dice rolling interface, as now adding guidance to your character is easier than ever. When asked to make a roll, if any character in your party can provide guidance, then you can click a button and you can have the spell added. Something that is both good and bad. The reason it's good is because, yeah, of course I want to have guidance on every single roll I'm doing. If I have the spell, I absolutely want the bonus. So making it easier to add is just a nice quality of life change, as before I was often buffing myself with guidance before most conversations, just in case there was a check I needed to make, which was tedious. On top of this, there were sometimes checks I would be able to make unexpectedly and I wouldn't be able to add guidance, even though Shadowheart was just standing there behind me. It felt dumb and immersion breaking, because why wouldn't I be able to say, hey Shadowheart, I'm about to make a religion check on this book, can you hit me up with some of that sweet guidance? Just like you can in regular D&D. However, not always having guidance available sometimes makes sense. If you're in a conversation and you were trying to convince someone, it doesn't really make sense that your character would turn to the cleric and be like, yo, I'm about to lie to this guy in an attempt to extort him. Do you mind dropping me a bit of that tasty guidance? You don't have time. Plus, if you're an NPC and you notice someone casually casting a spell on the person you are talking to, it might set off warning bells that tomfoolery is afoot. This is why most DMs don't allow guidance to be applied to charisma-based checks after the check has been asked for, because it doesn't make sense that you'd be guiding someone either after the thing has already been said or during the flow of conversation. This concept applies to checks that aren't during conversations too. Any check that is in regards to something happening in the moment is an occasion where this easy to apply bonus shouldn't occur. One example of when this was a little silly is when I talked to Astarion and he ends up putting a knife to my neck, so I go to make the dexterity check labeled quickly roll away. But then I added guidance. So what? While we were on the ground and I supposedly was about to make my nimble escape, Shadowheart walked over, touched me, and cast guidance, as guidance is touch activated. Then, only after that, do I bother to roll away, and while this is happening, Astarion just chills out and waits. Like, what is going on here? Another time where I thought it was weird is during this moment where I'm trying to persuade Shadowheart to get information from her, and then she guides me on that persuasion check against her. It's just kind of weird. Hopefully in the future, Larian will go through and identify each individual check and determine which would make sense to have guidance applied and which wouldn't, as currently the system is simply you can get a buff on any check regardless of if it makes sense, and it's fairly world breaking. Although honestly I'm not massively concerned either way, and it's early access, I'm sure they'll figure this out. Now I've been focusing on guidance, and that's because most people will have this spell and it's a cantrip so you can use it whenever. But everything I've discussed applies to the spell Enhance Ability, which gives the player advantage on rolls of a certain type chosen by the caster, i.e. advantage on wisdom rolls or charisma checks. When playing on patch 4, I never knew when to use this spell, as I never knew when it would be relevant, and I didn't want to preemptively cast it since it uses a spell slot. However, this change also lets you add enhance ability, an excellent change because when you really need the boost to your chances, you can add this buff with ease, basically actually allowing you to use the spell. This is also a small point, but the game doesn't just tell you the number between 1 and 4 that guidance provides before the roll, just like stat and proficiency bonuses used to work. Although it would be better if it left the 1d4 bonus to the very end, rather than going before the proficiency roll. This would capture the routine of actual D&D, as most players add guidance last and makes the spell contribution feel that bit extra special. Like on this one occasion where I didn't have proficiency. I wasn't worried because I only needed to roll a 0. I got a nat 1, which apparently equals a -5, and thanks to guidance was able to push the d20 roll back to a nice round 0. Ultimately, I think the change is good and I like it because it streamlines the game and makes it more fun to play, which is great because it's a game. But a few tweaks on when it can be applied are required for it not to just be a perma buff you always get, regardless of if it's logical or not. Trying to recreate the magic which is D&D, an esoteric and mainly imagination-based game, is a borderline impossible task. However, even just in early access, I found that Baldur's Gate 3 is doing a pretty excellent job of this. This change to the dice rolling UI goes a long way to embody the feelings, the emotions, the energy of rolling dice in D&D, and honestly, I'm so impressed they've managed to implement this abstract concept into the game. What Larian has already showed with BG3 has demonstrated they are truly capable of emulating the essence of D&D, and this change has bolstered my faith that this game can be everything we want it to be. If you're still here kicking it at the end of the video, then big shout out to you. Please like the video if you enjoyed it and subscribe to the channel for more smorgasbord gaming related content.